So I guess I thought it'd be useful just to kind of very briefly take stock of where we are with electoral registration at the moment, because it has been a time where we've seen quite a lot of change within the last 10 years or so. Electoral registration has been kind of characterised by continuity for about a century, and then all of a sudden there has been some dramatic kind of changes come through. So in the past few years, for example, we've seen online voter registration for the first time, individual electoral registration UK-wide for the first time since 2014. And there's then been some kind of correctives to that. So the Higher Education Act was a way of bringing universities into the fore to encourage them to boost voter registration rates. And there's some very important, not very widely discussed outside of the electoral community reforms coming on this year in terms of the move to canvass reform, which was going to make quite a significant change. I sometimes call this automatic re-registration, because it's basically going to mean that people who are in the same in a house, have remained in that location, and who electoral officials can use data sources to check that they are still there, and won't have to take proactive action to re-register. So some of the issues that we're talking about are already being introduced. And it's also a particularly important time because in Scotland and Wales you've seen devolution over the way in which the electoral register can be run, and in both Scotland and Wales there is currently live legislation, live bills relating to this. So it seems to be a really kind of critical moment, really, to think about, well, what next? Where is this kind of going to? What is a longer term plan of reform? And I think in the report we try to set out some of the key kind of pressure points that there are in the current system, and these are pretty well documented and have been featured both in the media and in reports elsewhere. So the first one is about people being missing from the electoral register. So this is the Electoral Commission's own research. The last evaluation of the accuracy and the completeness of the electoral register showed that there are roughly around 9 million people missing or incorrectly registered on the electoral register. That was the December 2018 register. And also that the people that are missing come from different socio-demographics as well. In some ways, if every single kind of group had the same level of voter registration, there might be less of a reason for concern. But the fact that voter registration is lower amongst younger, private renters, citizens with particular nationalities, Black, Asian citizens, people concentrated in London, low income educational areas, and so on. And obviously these combine as well in many ways. It is a particularly pressing issue. And also that there is a longer term trend towards declining levels of completeness. Some of the discussion is focused on the effects of individual electoral registration, but in fact there's actually longer term changes in terms of the increasing mobility of the population. And this is important because as research from Alistair Clark and myself has kind of shown, the experience of the voter is also often that they think that they're registered and they turn up on polling day and they want to go and cast their votes, but there are a small minority, but an important minority, that are finding themselves not being able to cast that ballot because they've misunderstood part of the electoral process. And there's some other pressures there as well. And these partly come about as a result of some of these changes. Some research that shows that there is a lot of local authorities that are under kind of funding pressures, and these have heightened following recent reforms in the voter registration process. The other side of the COVID crisis, obviously these are going to be very much to the fore. And there's also something about business processes here. There's now, electoral registration has become very seasonal. It's become very last minute. So whereas the annual canvass could historically be relied upon to bring about regular levels of registration, there is now very much a last minute effort in the days the hours, the minutes, the seconds before their deadline to apply, and many of those applications are also duplicates. So some critical issues there. There's also concerns about privacy, and but Paul is going to kind of speak to some of those a little bit later on in the presentation. So the question then is how can the electoral register be compiled? What are the different methods? And this is quite important because the term automatic voter registration is used quite widely and very loosely in some public discussions. And so we really want to kind of try and kind of pin this down to a very precise definition, because this is really important, we think, in terms of getting to grasp with some of the issues. And broadly speaking, we think automatic voter registration is basically the direct enrolment of citizens onto the electoral register without the need for some proactive action from them. They don't need to take any steps. The electoral official at the other end is automatically adding their name onto the electoral register. And this is in stark contrast to, at the bottom of the screen there, the kind of laissez-faire, as we call it, approaches, where basically the state does nothing. There's no direct interventions there. It's up to the individual citizen. It's an individual responsibility for them to go and get their name onto the electoral register. And that's broadly the system that we have here in the UK, where it's an individual responsibility to register online, or albeit reply to an annual canvass. And in the middle, there's perhaps a system called assisted voter registration, where it's still largely an individual responsibility, but people are prompted when they access other government services. Now, the figure here might be a little bit difficult to see, but what we did was to map out the experiences around the world to see what is the general trend. And broadly speaking, automatic voter registration is actually the norm around the world. So you can see the three different categories there. In most countries, automatic registration immediately takes place. Those countries that don't have automatic electoral registration, over there on the left, includes Cyprus, Ireland, Jamaica, Mauritius, New Zealand, UK, obviously have something in common in many senses. And we think that's probably largely connected to colonial history and connections with the United Kingdom. So there's a different kind of culture there. But in practice, what has happened is that many of those countries that haven't had automatic voter registration from the start have, over the last few years, tried to experiment and introduce different forms of this in different ways. And as you say, there are success stories and there are stories of failure as well. Though, as with any kind of system, you have to be careful with how it's administered, whether it's properly resourced and properly managed all the way through. But there are success stories. One of these is Victoria in Australia, where they originally had the system that we largely had here in the UK that relied on an annual canvass. They called it something slightly different. They found, just as we had that in the UK, that there was declining levels of completeness over time as the population became more mobile. And so they started to write out to citizens using other government databases to try to target missing voters. And that was helpful, helped clean up the registers, but also led to increasing the case that many people were still being removed from the register as well, and weren't actively adding their name. So in 2010, they went to a system of direct enrolment for some particular groups, so not universally, but just focusing on young people. So shortly after they turned 18. And the evidence from Victoria was actually that a large number of those people who were directly enrolled did then go on to vote. So what could AVR look like in the UK? Again, this is really important, we think, in terms of shaping the debate, because AVR is very loosely thrown around, and actually what it is in practice could take very many different forms, and there's huge implications for all those. The first one is the creation of a civil population register. And basically the reason why many countries are able to do automatic voter registration and haven't thought too much about it is because they create their registers from a civil population register. Now, we don't have that in the UK. There were some debates about that many years ago. Broadly speaking, there was a lot of concerns, perhaps from a civil liberties perspective, about that, and clearly that would be a major reform, and not as a result of that, one we kind of endorsed in the report. The second one would be kind of like a civil population register by proxy, in that you could perhaps in some way try to expand an existing database of citizens and use that to create electoral registers. And the most obvious one there would be the Department of Work and Pensions CIS database. And basically that's because when everyone tries to register, citizens are automatically checked on that database in the first place. But again, there's huge implications for that. It would involve a move to a single centralized database, which is perhaps good, and would cut away some of the local knowledge and expertise that we have in the current system. The third way is to introduce what we call localized data mining. So electoral registers would remain in the hands of local electoral officials in the country, but they could be given access to other national data sources, such as the DVLA database, and then they could be allowed to add names to the electoral register automatically where they see citizens might be on one database but not the other. And again, we had concerns about that in the report. This has been tried to some extent. This has been piloted in the UK. It was effective at adding some names, but not that many. And there's always the question here of, well, which data is the most up to date? Is it the one that the electoral registration officer has, or is it the one that the DVLA has? And it's not always clear which is the most up to date. The two alternatives we think are more useful might be direct enrolment for particular groups, like as introduced in Victoria, but also introducing some kind of opportunities for assisted voter registration. Now, clearly all these approaches have big philosophical issues underlying all this. So should it be compulsory to be on the electoral register? Should citizens be able to opt in or opt out? And there's different responses to that. And I think what we try to do as much as possible is to flesh out those arguments in the report, whether it's one way or the other. And they've often been expressed by parliamentarians, for example, in both houses. You know, on the one hand, you could argue it's an individual responsibility to register to vote. On the other, perhaps it's a state. You know, the state can, if it can identify citizens, perhaps it should take that action. Some democratic theorists would tend to argue that elections should be a level playing field, and so if you can identify different levels of different inequalities, different levels of electoral registration, then perhaps proactive intervention is needed. But this aside, the aim of the report is to try and give room for those arguments. And what we tried to suggest was something that had more of a balance between them. So this on the screen, hopefully that you can see, the letter that citizens will receive just before they're 16. Back in my day, you should get a little card as well. It'll have your national insurance number on it as well. Don't have that anymore. But this is an opportunity, we think, to boost numbers on the electoral roll. This gives people their national insurance number. At a minimum, it could give people information about how to register to vote. Ideally, this could be an opportunity to add automatically citizens onto the roll, because they are identified. We know where they are, we know who they are, and this would be an opportunity for civic education also to be integrated with this moment. So we're only really suggesting automatically registering citizens at that particular moment. There's then a large section of the report where we try to look at different options for assisted voter registration, trying to think through not where there are big databases of citizens, but where a citizen would go about needing to interact with a government service, so that at that particular moment in time, when, for example, they applied for a passport, we knew that the information that they entered right then and right there would be more up to date than any other record. And so these are some of the options that we kind of came across. I mean, I think what's really, really important here is selectivity in terms of these sources. You wouldn't want to overwhelm electoral officials with an overwhelming range of new applications because of those resource issues. But you could make it optional for people to register to vote at this stage. You're applying for a child benefit application at this moment in time. Would you also want to register to vote? And I guess I'd also add there, I mean, applying for a passport, this huge volume of applications there, that isn't necessarily the most important one, because you perhaps want to think about targeting this for under-registered groups. But this is how some of the options that could be considered going forward. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Paul, who's going to take over with some of the privacy issues that we're looking at in the report.
Great, thank you very much, Toby. I just wanted to make a couple of points to start off. One of the things is I was very delighted to be asked to contribute to this report, because it was a recognition that actually privacy issues are key to what's going on here. And it's really important that we don't see privacy as a kind of add-on, a last-minute thing to be considered. This is something that underpins the whole issue here. And we've seen in recent years how privacy and democracy are very closely tied together. So I think the starting point here is to understand that we're talking about something that could be considered a movement towards a kind of database state. Now, this is potentially a way that data on us is recorded in a way that is more accessible, more usable, more manipulable than any other particular form. And that means we have a particularly good, particularly important level of responsibility that comes in. The first aspect of that, the most direct aspect, is things like the use of the register by credit reference agencies and others who could potentially use it in ways that people might not like. That creates an effect on people. And when I say on this slide that privacy and data protection are not the same thing, that's where we need to start to think about it. One of the biggest effects of databases being created is that they create a chilling effect on whether people want to do something. If you think your data is going to be misused, you're less willing to allow your data to be gathered and to come into practice. And that's the most important thing here when we're considering electoral rolls. We want a role that is complete as best as possible, and that includes these marginalized groups as best as possible. And these marginalized groups are often people who have bigger concerns about privacy in particular than mainstream populations. So we need to reduce that chilling effect. We need to make it as safe as possible for people to be on this database so that they don't feel it's a risk to be included. So that's the starting point when thinking how else might it be used. And this is where commercial use of the electoral roll, either by credit reference agencies or the edited register by many more commercial organizations, needs to be considered much more carefully. And our recommendations are very direct and strong on this point. Similarly, to protect in the same way, we support anonymous registration and extending the periods of anonymity that are available. Again, this is to give protection to people, to encourage their inclusion within the register. So when we're looking at assisted registration in particular, we need to look at expectations that people have over when they would be included in the database. Now, that means expectations about sources. Would my inclusion in a certain database mean I'm likely to be added to the electoral roll? Would we expect that? Similarly, expectations about consent. Would I expect to be asked whether I'm added at this point? Would I expect to have a choice whether to be added at this point? These are important things in terms of how we actually behave. And this needs to be considered specifically in relation to the way that what I've described on here as the new data environment works. That is, your data can be used in many more ways by many more organizations than ever before. That places more responsibility on those who create databases and who make them available, to understand how these things might be used. And that's particularly true here, where this is potentially an incredibly powerful database. So, final point is on where this goes. And I talk about in the report misuse and function creep and potentially abuse of the database. Now, this comes in two distinct areas. One is, can this data, both the specific data and the database as a whole, be used for things that were not intended at the start, but evolve through what we call mission creep, function creep, or similar terms. This happens in the data environment we have at the moment very, very regularly. I mean, examples include the cameras set up to monitor the congestion charge in London, for example, which initially weren't going to be used for anything else, but now are used for crime prevention and so forth. The point about function creep is that each little creep feels reasonable and sensible and appropriate, whether for a good use or for efficiency or something like that. But it is nonetheless a change in what's happened. And if people are aware of this and afraid of this, it might reduce their willingness to participate. The second thing is to understand that if we're moving this way towards automatic voter registration, that might move us further in other ways. It might mean, it might fit in well with the move towards voter ID, ultimately to ID cards, which, as Toby's already referred to, we have some resistance to in the UK. There's a long history about this, a number of seminal legal cases, and eventually to potentially compulsory voting, which is something we have not considered here, but it's interesting that one of the best examples that Toby has highlighted is from Australia, where voting is compulsory. And we need to understand when we're setting up systems like this that all these things potentially can work together, and we need to consider them when considering where we move at this point. That's kind of an outline of where we are on this. I would suggest very much you read the report, and here are our contact details, and we're happy to be contacted. Those are our email and Twitter handles. We're happy to be contacted and are ready to field any questions that you don't want to field here. We can field them by email afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul and Toby, for those introductory remarks. I'm going to, in a moment, introduce our three respondents. Just before I do that, just to say the Q&A facility is, I think, open for use. So if you want to register, start to register questions in there, please do so. I'm told there's also the facility, and I think if you see a question that's already been asked that is in your line of interest, you can, what I think is called, upvote that question by clicking on the little thumbs up symbol, and that will give me a clue that there are more people who would be interested in the answer to that particular issue. So we have three respondents who kindly agreed to contribute to this session. The first of those is Peter Stanyan. Peter is the Chief Executive of the Association of Electoral Administrators, which is the independent professional body that represents the interests of electoral administrators in the UK. Prior to starting work with the association, he was employed by 2 London boroughs, 2 district councils, and was seconded to the Electoral Commission on 2 separate occasions. So Peter has extensive knowledge, clearly, of the way these things work in practice. Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for the introductions to the report. So where I've read it, the report from cover to cover, I would say very thought-provoking and certainly wider than just automatic registration, the automatic voter registration. As an association, I think it's fair to say we agree with many of the sentiments that have been expressed and the challenges that have been raised. Certainly, I think Toby made reference to this in his introduction. The registration of electors has been transformed, and I think it's referenced in the report, since 2000. I remember that happening as New Labour came into power back in that time with the introduction of rolling registration. And the speed of change just seems to be increasing. We've got canvas reform to come, which does address some of the issues that have been introduced by individual electoral registration. But I think one of the key points we need to flag up in the whole situation is that canvas no longer registers electors. It's simply a fact-finding exercise. The changes that are being talked about will go some way towards that, but it goes back to the point that fundamentally we're in that policy position of it being individuals' responsibility as things stand. In strange ways, AVR actually relates back to the old household form of canvassing, which was a far simpler thing for administrators to administer. Individual electoral registration removed that ability and made it a far more complicated bureaucratic system, but also introduced an awful lot of access to the system through the digital service, and also a greater degree of trust in that we've got individuals who are who they say they are, although obviously the responsibility about residency still rests with the individual registration officers. And I'll come back to residency in 1 second. Very reassured with Toby's comments with regards to the concerns about resourcing of electoral services, particularly at these times where ultimately it's problematic. Some local authorities are able to maintain funding levels, some are really having to cut back at this stage. And certainly anecdotally, we know already that we've got the challenges of almost every electoral services team in the country has been seconded out across their authorities to assist with the current pandemic and responses to that, which is testament to their multitasking skills. There has been a lot of improvement in access to data sources, sharing of data, data mining, data matching, but sometimes the lack of resources does get in the way, and I think that's referred to in the report in terms of what can reasonably be done at local authority level. Going to sort of with regards to the really interesting bit that we 100% agree with is the issue with regards to access and availability of electoral registers. And there is certainly a feeling in the electoral community that trust in the register of electors would be increased if it was used solely for the purpose that it was being collated for, which is to actually allow people to cast their ballots at the ballot box. The AE's view has long been that the register should only be used for those purposes, and having said that, wider democratic purposes, and quite rightly for law enforcement, security and the like. So credit reference agencies should have access to registers to make sure there is the validity of those applicants, but not be able to use it, a document that's compiled through public funds, then used for commercial gain. Unfortunately, that's one of the issues that does cause an awful lot of challenge to administrators in terms of trying to answer those queries when it has very little to do with the day-to-day job they're actually doing. So we would fully support the removal of the open register and just simply strip it right back to the purpose. Just again, anecdotally, there are also restrictions that are currently in place could do with actually relaxing slightly, because a big battle at the moment is with regards to actually accessing the electoral register to assist with the pandemic, to actually identify over 75s, for example, which at the moment is not there. So a wider look at all of that accessibility, I think, will be a positive thing. We've got no real view in terms of things such as extending to 5 years for anonymous electors. The only sort of thing there will be to work it through. We've already got that for service voters, and there's a danger that we lose contact with those individuals. And the last thing we would want is letters being sent to a property where anonymous electors actually left. So we'd need to work that through with the experts in that field, including Women's Aid, who have been very, very positive, added very positively to that debate. But the major real benefits to us of the AVR system is really registering attainers, under 16-year-olds, under 14-year-olds with devolution, if at all possible, in Scotland and Wales, and of student registration, and of those sort of large establishments where IER has taken away that ability to do that. We're less sure about the sort of the signposting absolutely through government agencies. The opt-in to registration through government agencies is slightly less sure about, solely because ultimately, although there's a requirement to register or respond to an application to register, going back to my point about residency, individuals can be registered to vote in more than one location. So if we're automatically opting people into a register, we'd need to make sure there's the ability for them to say, no, I do not want to register at that address because I'm registered elsewhere. There could be a danger of duplicate applications, which is a major issue. increasing as a direct result of direct interventions. Slight concerns about how the system would be administered in the run-up to elections. There's talk about it being 4 weeks beforehand to allow for anonymous registration and the like. How would that work in terms of the season-led type thing that Toby referred to earlier? Anonymous I've referred to in the right not to register if someone's registered elsewhere or has dual nationality, for example, and doesn't wish to sign up in terms of their British nationality. One area that would be useful to consider as well in the wider scheme is AVR for home movers. One of the massive changes is with regards to, or challenges, sorry, is with regards to individuals who have to move within one local authority area. They have to go through the whole process of registering again. Why can't we just passport across where we know those individuals and have got that reassurance to take away some of that pressure? And I think the final points I would just add, last 2 points really, is the challenge of devolution and the pressures that will come, certainly as Wales moves toward it. Scotland a long way down that track already, but also to slightly challenge Toby's categorisation of the UK system being a laissez-faire system, because there is a lot of intervention goes on already behind the scenes. I understand why that was being categorised in that way, but ultimately it's just to make sure that we build on what we've got, accepting the point that the canvas is no longer the body it used to be. The 1st December register is no longer the actual most accurate and complete register, and to actually make sure that we can add to complete and accurate registers in time for the most important points, which is polling day, whenever that may well be.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. I'd like to introduce then next Darren Hughes. Darren is Chief Executive of the Electoral Reform Society. ERS campaigns for reform to the voting system for the House of Commons and takes a keen interest in democratic issues and how they operate in the UK and whether or not they're fit for purpose. Darren is a former New Zealand Member of Parliament and served as a Minister, I understand, in Helen Clark's government before relocating to London in 2012. So, Darren, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and good afternoon to everybody. I think it's a great report. Really enjoyed reading it, and I'm so pleased to see how many people are interested in this topic and want to have this conversation about these points. The report, helpfully in its title, asks a question: is it time? And I think the answer to that is a resounding yes. We've either got to get there as quickly as possible, or we've got to recognise the glacial pace at which some of these things sometimes move and begin the work in order to land at a position where AVR is the status quo. I think that's a very important thing. So yeah, really welcome and timely report for us to be considering. For us at ERS, we've been sort of following this from around about 2011 when the IAR move started to really get flesh on the bones during the early years of the coalition government, and I think that we come down on the philosophical question that the report goes through. On that philosophical question, we do come down on the side of that it should be a responsibility as a citizen to register. So we believe that the state should use the instruments of the state to ensure that's as effortless as possible for people to then make the democratic choice about what they do with it. But you've got to start on an even keel, which to us seems to be having everyone on the register, which then leads on to these discussions about accuracy, completeness, and hard to reach communities. I might just say, make the point that these things are really quite important, these topics of voter registration. And I think like a lot of systems, whatever they are, there are often chunks of them that are overlooked, considered a little dry, a little boring, not kind of worthy of looking into. But actually, it's when these things go wrong that you can have quite catastrophic effects. And I think there's really a responsibility on those of us who are trying to push the wider, democratic reform, involvement, a full democratic life, I guess, in the UK, to really get these building blocks right. And I think you don't need to look too far in countries that are otherwise quite similar in culture and values to see what happens when these sort of topics get corrupted or become so hyper partisan that it's actually a major turnoff for your ordinary citizen, who of course is not by definition a highly partisan person. So I do think this is a very worthwhile thing for us to be spending time looking at. I think also that one of the reasons for that is that in the last 10 years or so since there's been the change, there's been improvements. We probably know a lot more now about the state of play, but it does feel as though we're now at a bit of on a curve, popular language at the moment, where actually some of those gains risk being eroded, or some of the original policy objectives around completeness and accuracy, we're just not quite getting there because it needs another shot in the arm. I think this report is that great shot in the arm. 28 recommendations which I encourage people to look at, and they're either things that I felt you could agree to very, very quickly, or as Peter was just pointing out, some things that require a little bit more discussion, but you'd get to that point once you had the input of others. And I hope that there can be some more convening around some of those topics. For us, we've been looking at promoting these notions of the motor voter type arrangement, most evidence in some of the states in the US. And I think I really like this idea of the life moments in the report. And we saw that table there of all these things where citizens access the government for, and these should be things that we also link the chance to register to vote to be part of that in an AVR setting. And I think those are things that would be very helpful. A few other things, I think we need to link these to some of the other political issues that go on. I think of the controversy around the boundaries setting. We now have incredibly old boundaries. It's not right, and I think that really brings back the integrity of the register. And we should make sure we're injecting these points into some of the other discussions that are underway. The other thing that we would like to two other things we'd like to see actually. One is the ability to have same-day registration on election day. If we're interested in completeness and accuracy, and we identify communities that are hard to reach, that they will often be people who might decide to vote on the day of the election. And I know that creates a headache in some respects, but if we're serious about the wider point of the register, and we're serious about a full and active democracy, then we need to think about what the trigger points would be for people who might find themselves not registered. So having some flexibility around that and around polling stations, I think, would be good. And then the other really important thing we would like to see is the ability for online lookup. In the 2019 election in December, a lot of discussion around the high uptake of new registrations. I think over 600,000 on a single day at one point, but of course a lot of duplication, which at a stressful time for the ROs and for the infrastructure around running an election is just so unnecessary. And I think that really should be something that is addressed so that we can get more people engaging and checking their own details. So I guess to finish on more of a point of disagreement, which does come out of this issue around the online lookup. This notion or this discussion around more of a centralized national register, single register, so that some of these reforms could be made more straightforward, is a legitimate point of difference and debate because of where we start from. And I know that in most of our democratic discussion, it's a decentralization, devolution, pushing power and responsibilities away from the centre. But on some of these things around getting a complete and accurate electoral register, I think we need to keep having that debate around that. And I think the DWP proposal is a really good one for us to start that discussion. And just to finally to thank Toby and Paul and UEA for doing this work, especially Toby, who's been a real stalwart on this topic and not let go of it, which I think is so important, and to the Roundtree Reform Trust and Democracy Fund for making it happen. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Darren. Some really thought-provoking questions you've opened up there as well, and hopefully we'll take us on some interesting debate later. Technical issues have intervened, but I'll swiftly move us on, and I'd like to welcome Elsa from the Electoral Commission. So Elsa Irvin has been the Electoral Commission's Director of Electoral Administration and Guidance since January 2017. She was at the Commission for 16 years, holding a number of different positions since starting as a Policy and Practice Officer in Scotland in 2003. In 2010, she became the Head of Guidance, leading on the Commission's guidance, support and performance standards work. As Director, Elsa also leads the Commission's teams across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and co-chairs the Electoral Coordination and Advisory Board.
Great, thanks Jessica. I hope you can all hear me all right. Very much welcome the opportunity to be here this afternoon, to be part of the discussion, and very much welcome the report and all the work that's gone into it. I think it's a really important contribution to the debate on modernising electoral registration in the UK, and that's a debate that we at the Electoral Commission feel is a really important debate to be having for all the reasons that Darren's just mentioned. I think what we've already seen over recent years is the transformative nature of changes like the introduction of online registration, which has made it much easier for people to access the registration process. Later this year, as has been mentioned, we're going to see some changes to the annual canvass process, and that's going to give EROs a lot more flexibility about how they manage the process in their area. And that's going to be using data much more effectively to help them identify where there maybe should be changes made to the electoral register and to target their limited resources far more effectively. So I think these are important changes, but absolutely there's more that needs to be done to modernise registration. These should only be seen as an important next step really in improving our process. I think what we have seen, I think our research on accuracy and completeness of the electoral register has been mentioned a few times, and I think it's clear that that continues to be a challenge to trying to strive towards accurate and complete electoral registers. So while we're seeing electoral registers that have increased in accuracy since the introduction of IER, and registers where the levels of completeness have remained largely stable, what that does do is very much mask the fact that underneath that there are significant variations across different groups, as has been mentioned. So I think particularly what we're seeing is variations by age. So you're seeing younger people being significantly less likely to be registered correctly than those who are in older age groups. So you're looking at a difference from 94% levels of completeness for those aged 65 and over, compared to 74% for those aged 25 to 34. We also see significant variances along how long someone has lived at an address, from someone that's lived at their address for up to a year only being 36% complete, compared to 90% complete for those who've lived at their address for between 5 and 10 years. So there's a lot of variations within that overall stability of completeness. I think what else we've done with our research is we've been able to find out a bit more about public expectations around how they engage in democracy, and really seeing how that is changing over time. So the most recent public opinion research that we've just carried out in February found that 86% of eligible voters in the UK are actually satisfied with the voter registration process. But again, there's significant variations underneath that by age, with younger age groups, those aged 18 to 24 in particular, being the least likely to be satisfied with the process of registering to vote, which suggests that their expectations are not being met by the system as it is currently. And interestingly, when we asked people what would be the one change that we could make to the system that would increase their satisfaction with the system, the most popular option above everything else, which was chosen by 1/5 of people responding, was automatically registering people when they receive their national insurance number. So there is something that there is a public support there for. And I think, as well as has been mentioned by Peter and others, you know, it's, as well as this kind of pressure from the electorate, we're also seeing a desire for change for the system from those local authorities who are trying to deal with the process, finding it ever harder to continue to deliver within the current framework. In our report on the 2019 general election that we published last week, we highlighted again the pressure that EROs are under from the large number of applications to register that are made close to the deadline. I think we're seeing the move to event-led registration really kicking in at this point, and EROs are having to spend a lot of time processing applications late in the day and dealing with many duplicate applications. I think, as Darren mentioned, that's something again that we would very much want to see action taken to try to address the challenges of duplicates, if not actually to reduce the number of duplicate applications made in the first place. So I think taking all of that kind of background together, I think that really does illustrate the importance of the reform of the types that have been highlighted in the report. And the Commission, we ourselves have been looking at a lot of similar areas for reform over the last few years, and we published our findings from a series of feasibility studies last year, which looked very much at the practical implications of how you would implement different types of automatic and assisted registration in a UK context. And I think from our perspective, I think fundamentally what we believe is that the key to it all is a modern electoral register is one that uses trusted public data to keep itself accurate and complete throughout the course of the whole year, and isn't relying solely on action from individuals to do that. And that it makes it as easy as possible for electors to make sure that their record is accurate, particularly ahead of elections and referendums. So the range of reforms that we've looked at, which I say are broadly similar to those that are highlighted in the report itself, we believe these would help to achieve some of these things and would be deliverable fundamentally without significant reform of electoral administration structures in the UK. We've talked a bit about centralised registers. Well, actually, I think what we found is actually if you join up the existing local registers that you've got, there could be ways of achieving some of these reforms without needing to move to a centralised UK register. And if you take automatic registration as an example, I think, as has been said, it could really be an effective way of targeting some of those groups that we know are under-registered. So we've talked a bit about attainers. What we know from our research is in December 2018, only 25% of attainers were actually correctly registered. So if you were to look at automatically registering these people when you issue them with their national insurance number, it could have a very real significant impact. So I think it's really positive that this is something that's being actively considered by Welsh Government, and that they've included provisions in draft legislation which could allow automatic registration for local elections in Wales. So I think we really do see that there's a real prospect of progress in that area going forward. Just a kind of couple of points, some areas for further consideration I think that would need to be addressed in taking forward these types of reforms, because clearly they are complex and there's lots of different moving parts to them. I think data quality is a big area and a big issue to be considered. If you think about it, the higher level of automaticity that's in the registration process, the greater requirement there is for the public data sources used by EROs to be trustworthy, to be current and to be complete. So if you talked about using transactional data from reliable data sources, that could offer a lot of potential. But in practice, actually, what we might find is there could be few data sources that would contain all the fields that would be necessary to register a citizen automatically. So combining data sets might be complex, which might make it more difficult to implement in practice. Also, I think has been highlighted by Paul, a lot of issues around data sharing, around privacy that would need to be considered, around security of the system that would need to be considered, and also just the fundamental principle that automatic registration would represent a shift away from the current default that the individual needs to take proactive steps to register, update their details. So I think there's undoubtedly a fundamental point of principle there that requires further public debate before the reforms could be implemented. So I think there's clearly a lot of work that could be done, but I think from the Commission's perspective, it's absolutely essential that this work does progress. And we very much look forward to continuing to be part of this debate as we have been today, and to working with the governments across the UK to try and move forward some of these reforms that could help to make it easier for people to get registered and for administrators to keep the registers accurate and complete.